Welcome to the Building Community Through Dialogue event. We will be starting our program shortly. Please make yourself comfortable. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for the Building Community Through Dialogue event. Today's topic is Keeping It Real, Affirming the Asian Community by Building Bridges and Making Connections. Before we begin our program, we would like to review some Zoom housekeeping items with you. Today's webinar is being recorded. Please note, in a Zoom webinar, you will only be able to see and hear the presenters in today's event. Your video and audio will not be available for this presentation. Throughout the program this evening, you will be able to chat with only the hosts and panelists. If you would like to send a chat, please click on the chat icon on the bottom of your Zoom toolbar as shown on the screen. Please keep all of the comments in the chat appropriate. Failure to do so will result in the host removing you from this webinar. At the end of today's program, there will be a Q&A session. You may ask questions at any time throughout the program and they will be answered at the end. To ask a question, you will need to click on the Q&A icon located on the bottom of your Zoom toolbar as shown on the screen. Live transcript is available during tonight's webinar. If you would like to turn on the closed captioning, please click on the live transcript icon on the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. Here you will have the option to show subtitles and view the full transcript. To turn off the closed captioning, simply click the live transcript icon again and turn off the captioning. If you need assistance during the program, please email us at specialevents@csumb.edu. One of our event team members will be checking this email throughout the event to assist you. At this time, I would like to welcome Vanessa Lopez-Littleton to the virtual stage. Vanessa is the chair of the Health, Human Services, and Public Policy Department and an associate professor of public administration and nonprofit management. She will be your MC for today's event. Please give a warm welcome to Vanessa.
Thank you, Marlena. Good evening. I am Vanessa Lopez-Littleton, and it is indeed my honor to serve as the MC for today's event. This virtual event is being presented by the Building Community Through Dialogue Co-op Group. It is a discussion group of the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Assessment at Cal State University, Monterey Bay. In partnership with my colleagues, Dr. Vivian Waldrop-Patterson and Dr. Brian Corpening, we are the conveners of this community building co-op. Over the past several years, this group has provided a platform for sharing diverse perspectives as a way of challenging dominant paradigms, as well as ways of being, doing, and behaving. Our co-op represents a diverse cross-section of our campus community and provides conversations around critical and important issues. We are truly delighted to bring you this panel on Keeping It Real, Affirming the Asian Community, Building Bridges, Making Connections. We would like to begin our session for today by sharing the CSUMB land acknowledgement. California State University, Monterey Bay resides on the indigenous homeland of the Esselen people, also known as Carmelino, Monterey Band, and Rumsen. It is on the rich homeland of the Esselen where CSUMB not only thrives as an institution of higher education, but also provides an education abundant with service and experience to a diverse community of learners. As our students, staff, faculty, alumni, and community members explore the university's campus, remember to respect the land and take note of the natural beauty. Remember that ancestors rest below pathways and in other less traveled areas on campus. We are here, Lak Kai Lai. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our provost, Dr. Catherine Kantarjeff, to bring greetings on behalf of the CSUMB campus.
Good evening, everyone, students, faculty, staff, and community members. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight for a very special evening dedicated to creating community by building bridges. The people from whom you will hear tonight have all spent years creating intellectual links to bridge understanding across time and space. In these times when our society is deeply polarized, these connections, established through scientific inquiry and curiosity, are needed now more than ever. This dogged pursuit of new knowledge in areas of scholarship that sometimes deviate from the mainstream is emblematic of the California State University system. The CSU, a system that has long been a leader in ethnic studies, is decades ahead of larger, wealthier, and more long-standing established centers of higher learning. It is therefore with special pleasure that I welcome Dr. Russell Jeung, recognized this year by Time as one of the 100 most influential people in the world for his leadership in Asian American history. It is precisely this kind of overnight success, built on decades of diligent hard work, at which CSUs particularly excel. Here at CSU Monterey Bay, we pride ourselves on an interdisciplinary approach to research and student learning. We have the potential to lead the world in solving big problems through collaboration across disciplines. The CSU Monterey Bay panelists from whom you will hear this evening demonstrate how different scholarly perspectives can work together to generate a more complete picture of the whole. Please join us in our ongoing efforts to build and strengthen community together. We express our sincere appreciation to the Teaching, Learning, and Assessment Cooperative and the Building Community Through Dialogue Committee for coordinating and hosting this evening's panel. On behalf of CSU Monterey Bay, I wish you an exciting evening and hope that you renew and form new relationships. May you come away with new knowledge, ideas, renewed energy, and enthusiasm.
Thank you, Dr. Kantarjeff, for getting us off to a great start. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Laurel Lee Alexander, a truly phenomenal, awe-inspiring woman. For more than 20 years, Laurel has navigated the higher echelons of nonprofit management and philanthropy. She is the Vice President of Grants and Contracts at the Community Foundation for Monterey County, where she leads competitive grant making, program initiatives, and community engagement. Her professional career includes more than 12 years as the Director of Philanthropy at the Monterey Peninsula Foundation, which hosts the AT&T Pebble Beach Pro-Am. She held positions at Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, United Way, the Walt Disney Company, and the Colgate-Palmolive Company. Laurel has been successful in bringing a diverse perspective to senior level management. And one last note, because leadership definitely does matter. Laurel has served on numerous local and national nonprofit boards and is currently a board member and secretary of the Community Foundation's National Standards Board. She is also the immediate past president and first Asian American president of the Association of Junior Leagues International. Wow, what an honor. Her career and achievements are incredible. Laurel, the virtual mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I almost didn't recognize myself. And thank you to everyone attending today's panel. It is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Russell Jeung. Dr. Jeung is a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University and an author of books and articles on race and religion. Some of his most recent publications include Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, and Mountain Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies. In March 2020, Dr. Jeung co-founded Stop AAPI Hate with two groups, Chinese for Affirmative Action and the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council. The coalition tracks and responds to incidents of hate, violence, harassment, discrimination, shunning, and child bullying against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States in an effort to develop policy interventions and long-term solutions to end racism. Stop AAPI Hate was awarded the 2021 Webby Award for Social Movement of the Year. In addition, Time Magazine named its co-founders, including Dr. Jeung, as among the 100 most influential people in the world for 2021. We are so lucky to have him speak with us tonight. So we are proud to feature Russell as our keynote speaker. Russell, the virtual mic is now yours.
Thank you, Professor Lee Alexander. Thank you, Chair Lopez-Littleton. I'm really glad to join CSU Monterey Bay tonight, a fellow CSU campus. I'm grateful for the invite, especially from Professor Jenny Kuan, a longtime friend and colleague, and excited to share with you what's been happening with the organization I created, Stop AAPI Hate. It has been a real momentous, torturous year for me because last year in early 2020, that's almost 2 years ago now, we heard about COVID-19 coming from China. And knowing my Asian American history, I knew that history repeats itself, that whenever diseases came from Asia, Asians often were blamed in the US, scapegoated for those diseases. And then they not only were blamed, but they faced racist violence and xenophobic policies. And so we were really concerned that COVID-19 would bring a similar result. And I worked together with two organizations to document the racism, to create a website where people could report, to share their stories so that the government would know what was happening, so that we could track trends and we could actually come up with solutions. So we launched this website called Stop AAPI Hate in March 2020. And we opened it with 5 different languages. And I was shocked. Within the first week, we received hundreds of reports from Asian Americans across the nation. And the anger and the fear directed towards Asians was just palpable. It still stuns me to this day when I read reports still coming in about how horrific Asians are being treated, and taking that big picture view, it's been really actually traumatizing. And you'll hear some of these incidents. I'm going to invite, to give you a sense of what's happening, I'm going to invite Professor Kuan and Professor Nguyen to read some of them. And as you listen to these stories, these again are all reports. They're actually from elders. And you don't often think of Asian elders who go online to complain about racism, to stand up for their rights. But these elders are, because they know mistreatment when they experience it. They know it's racism and they want it to stop. So as you listen to these incidents, I want you and invite you to put yourself in these elders' shoes. See what it's like to feel what they're feeling at the moment and what the Asian American community overall is experiencing. And at the end, I'm going to invite you to put in the chat just a few of those emotional responses. So please pay attention as you hear these incidents.
Customer began screaming at me for no reason while in line and correctly distanced at 6 feet. I am mostly Chinese and my family has been in San Luis Obispo since the 1860s. I am 4th generation in San Luis Obispo, but guess I will never be an American.
Waiting to cross the street, I felt something on my head, and it turned out to be spit all over my hair and back of my coat. I was repeatedly spit on by a big white guy.
I was standing in an aisle at a hardware store when suddenly I was struck from behind. Video surveillance verifying the incident in which a white male using his bent elbow striking my upper back. Subsequent verbal attacks occurred with, "Shut up, you monkey," "F you, Chinaman," "Go back to China," bringing that Chinese virus over here.
On my daily walk in my hometown, Sausalito, wearing a face mask, a white woman yelled at me, "I hate Chinese people. Why do they come to this country?" When she passed me, I was stunned by her words and caused me to fear and be more alert of my surroundings.
My wife and I were taking a walk, minding our own business, when two dogs tried to attack us. When the woman owner came to us, she said, "The reason the dogs are afraid of you is because you eat dogs." Then said, "You need to go back from where you came from." We were shocked to hear this.
Waiting to enter pharmacy to get prescription. Group of construction workers not doing social distancing made fun of me, faking coughing, spitting, and made slanty eyes. No one else called this person out.
I was shopping and child grabbed my arm. Child said I should go back to my country, and I was the reason his father died. Mother came up and put her hand on my arm, but she didn't try to help me. Bakersfield occasionally has ignorant people who make fun of how I talk and look and tell me to go home. But this is scariest and saddest experience I've had in US since about 1977.
As I was leaving the restaurant, white male stormed up to me and verbally harassed and terrorized me, screaming, "Return to China, you effing Asian," and other hateful racial slurs, threatening me physically, a clear sense of racial hatred towards me. I gave a verbal account to an officer who arrived later. I have not heard back from anyone.
Thanks. So if you could put in the chat just a few words of your emotional response as you hear these incidents. Again, they're all elders. I see heartbroken, very sad, hurt, horrified, anger, disturbed, disappointed, sadness, pain, shame, devastated, extreme disappointment, sickened, very sad, sadness, horrified, horrendous, disgust, disappointment, heartbroken, devastated. This is the same fear that my mother and grandmother feel. Fear, disappointment. So I think thank you for all your messages. I think each of you now can understand what I think the Asian American community is experiencing overall. I am arguing that this is a period of collective racial trauma. It's collective because when one person experiences it, we see our elders experiencing this sort of attack. And even if we may not directly experience such a case, we still feel it vicariously. It's racial because we know they're not picking on individuals because they're a particular personality or they're a person they know. It's because they're Asian and they would pick on any Asian. And it's traumatizing because you could hear how people feel fear and depression, how people feel isolated and are hypervigilant. So this is, again, a lot like Japanese American incarceration in that the situations aren't similar, but the trauma experience will be long lasting, will be passed down, and will have long-term consequences. So to give you a sense, these incidents are just the tip of the iceberg. We've received 10,000 incidents since March through the end of September. And a recent survey that we conducted shows that 1 out of 5 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders experienced this type of racism in the past year. So that's over 5 million cases of hate in the United States like these. The racism in our incidents aren't just hate crimes, but they fall under 4 major categories. Civil rights violations make up about 11% of the cases. People are getting mistreated at the workplace. They're getting denied service, denied ride shares. People are experiencing microaggressions, like being verbally harassed, that's the bulk of the incidents, or being actively shunned, purposely avoided. But we know these aren't micro in impact. You see how horrific these incidents are. People face profanities, racial epithets. Oftentimes it's gang bullying, again, on elderly women. And so 1 out of 5 Stop AAPI hate respondents now display racial trauma. This is diagnosed 3 or more long-term symptoms of issues such as depression, anxiety, hypervigilance, and avoidance of places. So this is a traumatizing time. Cyber racism makes up 9% of the cases. Young people, I think, especially students like those at CSU Monterey Bay, experience this much more because they're on screens. Often our youth, at least 70% of our youth, in fact, report seeing racist posts, offensive memes at least once a month. And finally, physical assault makes up 16% of our cases, and being coughed and spat upon make up 8% of our cases. People were spit and coughing at Asians at such high rates. When I read the incident reports, we actually created a special checkoff category to make it easier for people to say, yeah, someone spat on me. My own wife was running on a trail in Oakland and someone just blocked her path and coughed directly into her face. I think people see that, or they blame Asians for bringing the disease, so they seem to want to reinfect us by coughing or spitting on us. And again, the physical assaults are scary. People are being pushed and shoved. People have bottles and rocks thrown at them. I wasn't surprised to see elderly killed this year, both in New York and in the San Francisco Bay Area, because I felt it was just a matter of time. We saw so many of these assaults. I wasn't surprised, sadly, by the Atlanta shootings or the Indianapolis shootings. We had actually prepared for such an eventuality, but you can never be that prepared. The trends have been really consistent. Bullies attack those whom they think they can bully, so women report twice as much as men. Young people and elders are often targeted. And it's clear racial profiling. Even though people blame China for the disease, 57% of our respondents are not Chinese. They're mostly East Asians who look Chinese, Vietnamese, Koreans, Filipinos. But a Latino person in LA was actually punched and told to go back to China. An Indigenous person in Vancouver was attacked and told to go back to China. So it's the profiling of Asians. People who look in a certain way will trigger others. So the question arises, it's only a biological virus, COVID-19. The COVID-19 doesn't discriminate. So why the surge in racism against Asian Americans at this time? Clearly people were afraid of the pandemic, but why blame the pandemic on Asians? There are 3 main factors, and the political rhetoric of last year really exacerbated that fear and targeted or directed that fear towards Asians. Already, and it's both parties, we have a US-China Cold War going on. Both parties are using anti-China rhetoric to be strong. And so when people bash China, Chinese people in the US get bashed. When President Trump insisted on using the term Chinese virus, though, we really saw the incidence of racism escalate. His hate speech went viral, and that hate speech led to hate violence. The term Chinese virus actually did 2 deadly things. First of all, it racialized the biological virus. It made the virus Chinese, and it stigmatized the people so that Chinese people were seen as the disease carriers. That connection that the virus is Chinese and Chinese people have the virus became part of people's implicit bias. It became part of what we call racial schema, how people saw the virus and how people saw Asians. They made that close connection and they sort of made automatic assumptions about Chinese people and about the virus as a result. This nexus of the virus being Chinese and Chinese people having the virus was really reinforced by media representations, both mainstream media and social media. So here you see a picture of a coronavirus party where students party while drinking Corona beer with pictures of Chinese people wearing the masks on. And some of these pictures had their eyes X'd out as if Chinese people had died. But this post went viral, as did this one, a photo of a Chinese person eating a bat, the supposed source of the disease. So what happens then is when people make that connection that the virus is Chinese, that Chinese people have the virus, they began to make automatic responses from that schema. A schema operates so that when, let's say you face a dog, you don't stop and think the dog's growling, the dog's teeth are bared, the dog looks angry. You make an automatic response in this face a threat and go into fight or flight. You make an automatic reaction. And in the same way, I'm arguing that because people were afraid of the pandemic and because people had that implicit bias that the virus is Chinese and Chinese people had the virus, people began to be triggered when they saw Asians and they would go into fight or flight response. The fight response is that they would harass Asians. The flight response would be that they would shun Asians. So we're not arguing that everybody is intentionally racist, but we are arguing that people are using racial lenses to view the disease and racial lenses to stereotype Asian people. This stereotype that Asians are scary, that Asians are disease carriers, that Asians are threatening, harkens back to the third factor, the yellow peril stereotype. This is a stereotype that Asians are a threat to the West. They're a peril. They endanger the West with their hordes of people and with their disease-ridden bodies. And this yellow peril stereotype has been used again and again, especially by politicians, to incite mobs, to rationalize racist policies, and to legitimate racist treatment of Asians. So to give you an example of how I said how history repeats itself and how the yellow peril has been invoked time and time again, let me give you a few examples. Here in this photo, you see the diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy are seen as specters of death emanating out of San Francisco Chinatown. Because again, Chinese were blamed for diseases, blamed for stealing white workers' jobs, blamed for being heathen coolie who are unassimilable. Congress then passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first legislation to exclude a group because they were the yellow peril. At the same time, in the late 19th century, over 200 Chinese settlements up and down the West Coast were actually forcibly removed. In fact, in Monterey in 1906, my great-great-grandparents actually moved to Monterey in the 1860s and had lived there for 4 decades fishing in this fishing village that had over 200 inhabitants. But because of the anti-China hysteria, Monterey townspeople wanted to develop the area. It's right across from the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And so they wrote to the landlord, Stanford University. Stanford then evicted the Chinese, but the Chinese wouldn't leave. When the townspeople complained again, the property manager was told, remove the Chinese by any means necessary in a telegram. And the next week, a mysterious fire burned down the entire village. And the newspaper said the next day, white people were cheering the burning of the village and looting the village. Stanford then bulldozed the rest of the village into the Pacific. And you can actually find pieces of porcelain bowls on the shores to this day, a century later. And then Stanford fenced off the area so that Chinese couldn't return. So my great-grandfather, seen here, his family had lived in Monterey for 4 decades, built a family and home, a thriving business. He, in immigration records, was known as one of the largest shippers of the day. My great-great-grandparents had to leave Monterey, forcibly displaced, and moved to San Francisco Chinatown as the only place of refuge from racism at the time. It would take my family 2 generations before we could become homeowners again. In 1900, then, the bubonic plague was found in San Francisco, and health officials segregated the area, they quarantined the Chinese, and they kept them in with ropes, barbed wire, and armed guards, presumably leaving them to get sick. In Honolulu and Santa Ana, health officials burned down the entire Chinatowns, leaving thousands homeless. So again, you see this Chronicle article that says the bubonic plague has eerie parallels to today. A disease comes from Asia, Asians get blamed, Asians face violence, and Asians face racist health policies. This continued at Angel Island Immigration Station. You know, if a European came from Europe to migrate, they stopped at Ellis Island and were usually processed within 2 or 3 hours. But at Angel Island, where Chinese and other Asians came, they were actually mass detained. And again, because they were seen as the yellow peril, seen as illegal aliens, seen as being disease carriers, Chinese went through lengthy interrogations. It would take weeks, and they faced really thorough medical checkups, as seen here. If deemed medically unfit, Chinese were actually deported. So 5% of the Chinese who spent their entire family fortunes, took a 3-week journey to get to Angel Island, never made it to California shores because they were deported back for health reasons. And so here you could see poetry that was inscribed on the walls of Angel Island that immigrants wrote about the injustices they faced in America. So you could see, just from my own family, because of race and because of health policy, my own family experienced exclusion, segregation, quarantine, detention, deportation, and later on, family separation. So what's happening, I think, is that Asians are faced with 2 types of stereotypes. We're either the model minority or we're seen as a perpetual foreigner. When the model minority, we're seen as white adjacent, we're seen as achieving, we're seen to be the group that others should emulate. But this status of being a real American is really, really conditional. For example, gold medal gymnast Xini Lee, she represented America on the International Olympics, right? She was on the, of anybody being recognized as an American, it would be her. But she just 2 weeks ago was pepper sprayed because someone just thought she was an Asian who didn't belong. So in times of war, such as World War II, when Japanese Americans were incarcerated, or after 9/11, when South Asians, Muslims, and Arabs faced Islamophobia, in times of economic downturn, and in times of pandemic, Asians are more treated as outsiders, as perpetual foreigners, as a yellow peril to be excluded. That's why in 50% of our incidents, people say things like, go back to China, you effing chink. You know America treats foreigners really badly. We build walls against foreigners. We think it's legitimate to separate children from their parents at the border if you're a foreigner. And apparently, if Asians are seen as foreigners, it's okay to spit and cough on our elders. So I would argue that this is one of the main sources of the racism, is that we've been stereotyped as the yellow peril, people who don't belong but need to be excluded. But history has repeated itself in one other way. In every case of racism, in every historic instance, Asians have always fought back. And during Chinese exclusion, during Japanese American incarceration, after 9/11, Asians have always fought for their civil rights, have always sought to belong. And I think today we're seeing the same movement. We're seeing history repeat itself in that way as well. I've really seen young people stand up to racism. We started a youth campaign, and within 1 week, we got 100 youth to spend their summers interning for Stop API Hate. They created their own policy report after interviewing 1,000 of their peers, and they actually got Congresswoman Grace Meng to propose legislation for ethnic studies. Here's a photo of middle schoolers in Berkeley who organized a 1,200-person rally, and they too are fighting for ethnic studies. We've seen our influencers and celebrities really stand up, and when mainstream media wasn't paying attention, they used alternative media like social media to really sound the alarm, so much so that their messages went viral and mainstream media finally began to pay attention to us. And I said that people are going into fight or flight response being triggered by Asians. In the same way, Asians are also going into fight or flight response in the threat of racism. We're being triggered, and so we're going to fight mode. I know a lot of Asians who are arming themselves, giving their kids mace, wanting more policing. We're also going into flight mode. We're the racial group least likely to send our kids to the classroom. We're telling our elders to stay indoors. But beyond fight or flight, there's one other response that I think is really adaptive. In the face of danger, in the face of threat, in the face of violence, instead of fight or flight, Asians are flocking. And I love this metaphor. We're flocking after the Atlanta and Indianapolis shootings, flocking together at vigils to grieve and find solace with one another. We're flocking at rallies like these in Chinatowns to find support and allyship. We're flocking back to ethnic enclaves to support depressed businesses. We're flocking to chaperone our elders and to escort them. And we're flocking here even tonight at CSU Monterey Bay to build community through dialogue. So because we've flocked, because we've built a movement, we have been able to make some change. Initial steps, but we've passed hate crimes legislation 94-1, which is remarkable given the polarization in our Congress. We've gotten President Biden to issue a few executive orders. And in California, we actually passed a historic, unprecedented API equity budget bill. This provides $156 million to address the racism that Asian Americans are facing. It's not just a simple performative denouncing of racism, but the state of California is actually putting their money where their mouth is and funding fights against racism and supporting victim assistance and community safety measures. The first 20 million is the RFP has just gone out this past week. So I think this is historic. We are making government, which has historically not recognized us for experiencing racism, seen us as a model minority, now finally seeking to remedy injustices of the past and address the racism we're experiencing today. So I'll stop there. I am just honored to join CSUMB for this dialogue, for this desire to build community, and especially for flocking with me tonight. Thanks.
Thank you, Russell. Your remarks are sobering and provide an opportunity for us to be more aware of the challenges that Asian Americans face. Stop AAPI Hate has become not only an invaluable resource for the public to understand the realities of anti-Asian racism, but also a major platform for finding community-based solutions to combat hate and racism. And its leaders have partnered with other BIPOC organizations to find restorative justice measures so that civil rights for all vulnerable groups receive the protection they deserve. When asked what is next for AAPI Hate, Russell said, quote, "The Stop AAPI Hate movement has just begun. We need to build the capacity to keep it operating long-term because we know the fight against racism is a lifelong battle. We want a movement that lasts," unquote. Lasting impact matters. Thank you again, Russell, for strengthening the foundation for lasting impact. To hear additional perspectives, I'm pleased to welcome back Vanessa Lopez-Littleton, who will introduce our panel and facilitate the discussion.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Laurel, and thank you, Russell, for that. I am delighted to I'm happy to flock with you. I feel like as an African American, we're always a part of a struggle, and it's something that's unique to our heritage. Is we've been fighting since we've arrived in this country, and so sometimes when there's opportunities to organize and to get into fellowship and partnership with other folks, we want you to know that we're here. We hear you. We suffer with you. And tonight is an opportunity to focus on not one Asian community, but the many Asian communities. So I'm honored to facilitate the remaining part of this panel. As we mentioned earlier, please feel free to submit your questions at any time through the Q&A function. Those will go to the panelists, and including myself, will get those questions, we'll vet them, and we'll try to get them out to our guest in a timely manner. And so now it's my honor to welcome to the virtual stage Councilwoman Kathy Biala. She is in her first term as a Marina City Councilwoman, and she's also the Mayor Pro Tem. Before running for office, she served on the Marina Planning Commission, where she advocated for Asian architectural design principles to be included in a downtown vitalization plan, which could celebrate the city's ethnic diversity. For several years, she has also led a community citizen action group to counteract environmental injustices, where the largely disadvantaged community of color was at risk of being exploited by a corporation that would compromise its sole source of drinking water. Recently, Councilmember Biala has been involved in efforts to accurately portray the tragic history of Chinese immigrants on the peninsula through a Walk of Remembrance event. She is indeed a powerhouse, and we are delighted to have her here with us today. And so, Councilwoman Biala, the question we have for you is, what are the untold stories about the Asian community, plural, you think are important to tell? There she is.
Thank you for that introduction. What does being the first Asian American councilwoman in Marina have to do with a Martin Luther King Jr. statue? Absolutely everything when it comes to diversity and inclusion. A beautiful artwork was created by a Black sculptor and donated to the city of Marina by an African American donor who wanted the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. to be always embraced by our community. Then for more than 10 years, it lay in storage, forgotten and invisible. I knew nothing of this statue until a white resident sent me a brochure about a garden that featured this statue. After the George Floyd murder, our mayor, Bruce Delgado, proposed resurrecting this statue at a budget hearing, but the previous council soundly voted to not dedicate any public funds to restore this city-owned statue. The statue could have remained in storage, in disrepair, had not the community come together to donate enough money to begin the process of restoration of the damaged bust. I'm your typical Asian who is modest and wishes not to call attention to oneself, but I was repeatedly asked to run for public office. In Marina, almost 2/3 of our population are people of color, with a significant percentage Asian and mixed race, often with Asian ancestry. I won by 70% of all voters. When I was campaigning, I encountered an Asian man in his front yard. His maybe 6-year-old daughter whispered to her father that she had seen my face in the campaign signs around the city. I was incredibly touched. I hope this little girl will someday follow in my footsteps and run for office. Our new council pursued completion of statue restoration and placement. Our mayor and I challenged the location of the statue, and our new council voted by a new majority to have the statue placed in front of the library with significant allocation of city funding. Promotion of other racial groups is promotion of all racial groups. As an Asian, if I saw visible evidence of, let's say, an MLK statue or an Asian garden or displays of Mexican artifacts or downtown banners with different languages, I would feel a sense of safety and welcome. The message that a community respects differences and sees the value of diversity. But the road to inclusion for us does not come easily, as we've seen. Black, brown, white, and Asian interests are exemplified in my real example, one of so many I have been involved in. Diversity and inclusion are not just thoughts and good intentions. We can truly make this our realities, but it will take all of us together. Thank you, and back to you, Dr. Lopez-Littleton.
Yes, thank you so much for that. You have such an incredible story. And someone put in the chat, you are an awesome councilwoman. So thank you for all that you do. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Phuong Nguyen. He is an associate professor of U.S. history in the School of Humanities and Communication at CSUMB. Like many of his generation, Dr. Nguyen arrived in the United States as a refugee following the Vietnam War. Growing up in Monterey County since the 1980s, he witnessed firsthand the changing demographics and dynamics of the region, which included seeing Monterey High School's class of 1993, inviting Japanese Americans from the class of 1943 to walk across the stage and receive the diplomas they were denied during World War II. Professor Nguyen received his bachelor's degree from the University of California, San Diego in ethnic studies and his PhD from the University of Southern California in American Studies and Ethnicity. He is the author of Becoming American, The Politics of Rescue in Little Saigon, published in 2017. I'm excited to welcome Dr. Nguyen to this conversation. And the question that I have for you, if you would, could you share with us some of the myths that the Asian communities, or even the recent violence, and how we as a society can be more inclusive in learning about the many different Asian communities?
Hi, Vanessa, and hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Have this extra guest here, my baby daughter, Audrey, who just woke up from her nap, so please bear with us, and she has the hiccups for whatever reason. Thank you for the question, and I think I'm going to really piggyback off what Russell has said already about these stereotypes of Asian Americans being portrayed as perpetual foreigners, as people who don't really want to be American, who are not really American. And I think that really begs the question, are these stereotypes true or not? And this is the kind of question I ask in my classes all the time. And after a while, I have to tell students that it doesn't matter if the stereotypes are true or not. Stereotypes are not designed to teach us anything. They are designed to justify the way people are treated in our society. And, Asians being treated as foreigners, as Russell has said earlier, is a way to justify the discrimination against them, because in American society, we have pretty much accepted that foreigners, people who are immigrants and recently arrived, should expect a little bit of friction and discomfort during their time here. We only seem to be able to muster collective outrage when it's real Americans, people who've been here long enough, are at the receiving end of discrimination. And I just want to discuss this in three particular stories here. One is story of the Asiana Airlines crash at San Francisco International Airport in 2012. And when local television station KTVU claimed to have received the names of the flight crew on board, they proceeded to share a list of very at least to Asian ears, obviously fake and stereotypical names. They said, we have the name of the crew. We have the captain is Something Wong, another member of the crew, Wee Tu Lo, Holy Fook, and Bang Ding Ao, not even realizing for a split second that these names were obviously ridiculous, and then being forced to issue a very strongly worded apology later on in the day. 3 years later, another incident that happened in California, Rini Simpat, Indian American who was student body president at my alma mater, University of Southern California, came home from a party, passing by Frat Row in USC, and walking by one of the frat houses, had a bottle thrown at her, and one of the frat boys yelled at her, called her an Indian piece of shit. And only after a while did someone realize that, oh, that's one of their friends, and came down and said, you know, I'm sorry that happened to you. It wouldn't have happened if we knew who you were. And she, you know, wrote this excruciating post on Facebook, wondering why she felt so bad hearing that, why it felt worse to hear that than the original incident. And her friend told her it's because we are subhuman to them by default. And that's why it's so excruciating. The third is how troubling it can be when we as Asian Americans internalize these stereotypes ourselves and even try to profit off them. Several years ago, I was interviewed by the Los Angeles Times for an article about a scandal that took place in Orange County, where coffee bars, Vietnamese cafes where coffee is served by scantily clad waitresses were doing more than just serving coffee. And the reporter, who was also Asian American, asked me if it was the trauma from the Vietnam War that explained why these Vietnamese men frequented these cafes. And, you know, with all due respect, I said, no, that's not why these men go to these cafes. They go to these cafes because they are men. And as heterosexual men, they enjoy seeing scantily clad women serve them coffee and do other things. And as a result of telling her the cold hard truth, I was not included in that article in the LA Times. The writer, who, like I said, was Asian American herself, decided to find another professor of Asian American studies or not, to give her the response that she wanted. So those are the kind of myths that pervade. And I think one of the ways we can overcome these myths, and there's an example in my book, Becoming Refugee American, is that when the population of Westminster and Orange County became Vietnamese enough that local white groups were gathering signatures for petitions to try to kick Asians out, or make sure that all the business signs had to be a particular way, there was at least one person who was willing to kind of break through the hate, break through the vitriol. Her name was Kathy Bucos. She was the new mayor of Westminster, California. And what she did is she went out of her way to really get to know the community, to step outside of her comfort zone. You know, this was a time when, you know, she was a moderate Republican at that time. This was a time where you could be a moderate Republican. Democrats at that time didn't have a monopoly on civil rights. And, you know, what she did was she got to know people. She went to businesses where she might have been the only white person, stepped out of her comfort zone, took the time to get to know people. And I think, you know, little things like that, of being able to know people and humanizing folks, is one of these steps that we can take to really get past all these stereotypes, get past the hatred, and to create better community. So literally building community through dialogue. So thank you for having me.
Yes, and thank you, Dr. Phuong. I wanted to say that we hear you and we love your voice in this space. We also appreciate seeing a male taking care of a child. I think for me, I loved it. I didn't notice anything was happening. We should see more of that as a society. So thank you for sharing your home and your space with us. So next up, we have Dr. Jennifer Kuan. I call her Jenny. She's an assistant professor of entrepreneurship and economics in the College of Business at CSUMB. Her research has been published in top economics and management journals, and she's been quoted in the press on her work on the semiconductor industry. Dr. Kuan studies the economics of innovation, including the existence of structural barriers preventing diverse scientists from contributing fully to new technology development and commercialization. Dr. Kuan is a delightful colleague, and I'm excited to have her on the panel with us today. So Dr. Kuan, the question for you is, from your research, what connections do you think we as a society or civilization should be making in order to continue to advance?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Vanessa, for inviting me. Yeah, I think an important overriding principle here is the extent to which structural barriers, have been created to discriminate and limit participation in a lot of settings. And so, for example, a lot of attention has been rightfully paid to housing discrimination and the structural barriers that were implemented intentionally in that setting, but there are structural impediments in all kinds of settings. And so documenting and measuring them, including kind of what Stop AAPI Hate is doing with measurement, is an important first step. I study the knowledge economy, and in that setting, discrimination can have an outsized effect that harms us all. So economists like my co-author have estimated that GDP per capita could be as much as 4.4% higher if women and minorities were able to participate fully in the innovation process. And that estimate is in line with other estimates that productivity is 20 to 40% lower over the past 50 years if we hadn't been misallocating talent like that. So I think the next step, after seeing that we're all paying a price for discrimination and exclusion, is to figure out what can be done. As a business school professor, I study institutions, and I'm interested in trying to figure out how structures can counteract, dismantle, and overcome these existing discriminatory, deleterious structures. So that's kind of a connection and that I would like to see us making, is how this is kind of crossing boundaries in various settings, and hoping that we can move forward in addressing them.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Kuan. Your work is powerful. I can't wait to read and learn more. This is incredible. So I'm learning so much about my colleagues. I know you guys, but I feel like I don't know you at all. So I feel like I'm learning more about you as I spend time with you in this space. And so last but certainly not least, I want to introduce one of my colleagues who's been just a real gem to me and so many others since I've arrived at Cal State. It's Dr. Angie Tran. She is a professor of political economy at CSUMB. She was born and raised in Saigon, Vietnam, from where she escaped by boat when she was 17 before settling in Southern California. Her research focuses on labor movements and resistance in Vietnam and transnational migration patterns of guest workers. Her book, Ethnic Descent and Empowerment, Economic Migration Between Vietnam and Malaysia, centers around integrating ethnicity, class, gender, religion, cultural resources, and third space of descent and empowerment. Her most recent study focuses on guest worker policies, such as the H-2A visa program in the US, and how those policies affect the working conditions of temporary agricultural workers. So it is indeed my pleasure to welcome Dr. Angie Tran. And the question that I have for Dr. Tran is, what types of actions do you believe will move us in the best direction for the future? There she is. Turn your mic on, Dr. Tran,
Turn
so
on.
we can hear you.
Sorry. Well, I have to start again. Well, thank you so much, Vanessa, for the very kind introduction. Just like you, I'm learning so much from my colleagues by participating in this panel. And I have to say that this is unprecedented. And I would really like to thank the organizers, especially Jennifer Kuan, who really got us together for this unprecedented panel for CSUMB Asian American faculty. So yay. So I would like to start by sharing two Vietnamese proverbs that I actually did share this in the anti-Asian hate rally on April 24th of this year. Đoàn kết thì sống, chia rẽ thì chết. It means unity brings life, division brings demise. The second proverb goes like this. Một cây làm chẳng nên non, ba cây chụm lại nên hòn núi cao. Which means that one lone tree cannot make a mountain, but three trees together can create a high mountain. And I was just checking the list of attendees, and I counted almost 200 trees here tonight, folks. So we have 200 trees in this kind of wonderful initiative. So my first point to move forward is that we need to promote cross-ethnic, cross-race solidarity, folks. Like Vanessa said, I came here as a boat person in 1980, after the end of the very bloody US-Vietnam War ended in 1975. But I'm just one of the thousands of Vietnamese refugees who benefited from the efforts of the African American community, who in 1978 called on back then the Carter administration and Congress to accept, quote, Indo-Chinese refugees from the three countries, if you recall history, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, into the US on the grounds of human rights and freedom, in the same spirit as the US accepting refugees from apartheid South Africa. So my deep gratitude, once and again, the African American community in the US. Then, thanks to a pathway to citizenship that I enjoyed back then, 6 years after I came here as a refugee, as a boat person in 1980, I then passed the citizenship test and then became a US citizen, and through hard work, through education, and became a professor at CSUMB ever since then, 25 plus years and counting. But I know that the path is not there for everyone. So, reflecting on my years as immigrant, I can relate to many immigrants here, immigrant women in Vietnamese community who do not yet even have US citizenship, and the farm workers from Mexico and from Central America who harvest food and fruit so we can put food on our tables. So my heart goes out to the immigrant refugee communities here in the US. That's my first point. The second point is that we need to acknowledge that the attacks on Asian and Asian Americans that Russell presented just so brilliantly at the beginning are part of the same capitalist system, the neoliberal system that thrives on division among peoples of color and attacks on Asians and Blacks and Latinx. So very painful, I have to admit this, yet important issue to raise among my own Vietnamese American community is the anti-Black racism. It happens, very painful to me. So it's important to point out that this attitude is a result of a structural, systemic racism, where the rich whites are often at the top of the power hierarchy. And that brings me to the third point. And because I'm a global studies person, I have to bring the global in, I have to bring the world in. Look, the capitalist system is not just in the US. The capitalist system is global. You know it, I know it. We need to promote an understanding of the transnational migration patterns. Very important, very significant to California and also to us here. Here, folks, we are an HSI campus, Hispanic Serving Institute. I see parallels of transnational migration patterns in my own work. So Vanessa mentioned my book, which is coming out next month in January, entitled Ethnic Descent and Empowerment, Economic Migration Between Vietnam and Malaysia. In that book, I examine the lives of migrant workers from Vietnam and the system the transnational systems that use them, and how different ethnic groups challenge this transnational system that coerces and exploits them. But they, the migrants, manage to carve out a third space for themselves, to find socially accepted means of resistance, to survive and even thrive at times. But I hasten to add that we live and teach here in Central Coast, California. Thus, we cannot ignore the working and living conditions of the farm workers who harvest, that we can put food on our tables. As a former refugee, I can relate to the plight of farm workers in this wonderful state of ours, California, nationally and globally. Most of the farm workers are migrants of different ethnic groups, especially from Mexico and Central America. The migrants who are already in the US have become aging, they become older, right? And most of the US born children do not want to work the fields. They have been learning about their rights and fighting for them. And many of them are attending CSUMB as first generation students. Okay, so I see my time is probably ending, so you can ask me questions afterwards, but you can ask me questions about the exciting study that I'm working with my colleague, Lorenzo Covarrubias, on the H-2A visa guest workers, farm workers from Mexico and Central America.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Tran. You're always such an exciting speaker. I'm going to come to your class one day. I'm just going to pop up and just sit in the back and listen. So now I'd love to invite Russell back to the stage if he's still here. I would love for him to react to some of the things he may have been hearing from our panelists as they introduce themselves. So Dr. Jeung, the floor is yours.
I really appreciated all the panelists' remarks about how to address the racism. Again, we know it's really institutionalized and structural, that it impacts our economy, it impacts our mental health, it impacts people globally, especially workers. We've seen that in our data too, that working class Asians experience twice the rate of racism that other Asian Americans face. So I just appreciate this effort to acknowledge all the aspects of racism, that it's not just interpersonal violence, right? That it's clearly historic, that it's clearly part embedded in policies that create disparities, and that we need to address racism in a comprehensive way, both through education, through expanding civil rights, and through interpersonal efforts to educate each other.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I do have another question that came from the audience that says, recent events such as the University of Chicago student being shot to death and Asian high schoolers being assaulted by African-American students in Philadelphia subway, that these events cause tension. So the question says, how do we address issues such as this in the Chinese community? But I'm also thinking more broadly. And so I asked that question specifically because there's been things in the media specifically about African Americans. So I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to respond to that. So we'll start with Russell.
Yeah, there is no real profile of the perpetrators of anti-Asian hate that we found. And it's not like it's overwhelmingly African-American or overwhelmingly white. But I think we are all susceptible to implicit biases. We are susceptible to anti-Asian racism. I would even admit that early on in the pandemic, if I saw an Asian wearing a mask, I would think that that person would be more infected with the coronavirus than a non-Asian. So we are all susceptible to having these implicit biases. I think we're all influenced by white supremacy. That being said, I think a lot of the concerns that get perpetuated, as the other panelist said, is that the media likes to heighten racial conflict that's not based on white supremacy. They like to divide and conquer groups, and they like to especially use fear and to use graphic violence to sensationalize racism. I think that's what's happening in these cases. A lot of the cases aren't necessarily hate crimes, but they just may be crimes of violence or crimes of opportunity, crimes of economics. And so the conflation of hate crimes with just crimes that everybody experiences, especially those in multiracial, low-income communities. You know, the crime rate overall is just high, and a lot of people have been victimized. I think that conflation of hate crimes with what people are experiencing already just exacerbates these racial tensions. So I do acknowledge that. I think anti-Blackness has been really increased as Asians face racism, and I think it's up to us to really address that head on and to acknowledge it.
So I see Kathy has her hand up, so you don't have to raise your hand, but I love it, Kathy, because I've got to go to Phuong. So after Kathy, I'd love to hear Phuong's reaction to this question.
Great. Russell, I really appreciate your comments about this. Recently, because of the more prominent featuring of African Americans victimizing Chinese, I was curious about that. And recently I've read two articles, one I believe from the New York Times and another one from more of a regional location, but they were saying that the overall violence towards Asian Americans is coming from the white population. But what happens is that statistically, what gets promoted and what gets investigated and what gets highlighted as a racial crime is when there is a person of color doing the violence or the harassment. And so you get this very skewed picture of who is actually being violent against the Asian Americans. So I just wanted to point that out because I always found that really curious. And it's because of media's part in, as you say, sort of encouraging division among people of color. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
So my turn. I think what really needs to happen is we need to have a kind of much more nuanced and complex discussion of the difference between most of our history, which is a history of survival, versus a history of justice, which we really don't see often enough, and which we don't really study in depth enough. I mean, it's often assumed in news reports, in mainstream conversations, in our everyday assumptions that certain groups will just kind of naturally coalesce and get together and fight for particular causes. And the media, for example, being as sensationally as it has to be, I guess, in order to gain clicks and ratings, doesn't mind promoting any notion of a race war, that white people are bound to all coalesce together, that people of color are bound to all coalesce together naturally. And that is just simply not really the case. That these kinds of connections require work, require effort, require dialogue, community building, whether it's the kind for social justice or the nefarious kind that promotes hatred and violence against other people. And that once we get to that state where we know that these coalitions, these divisions, these movements, for example, are not inevitable, that require lots and lots of work and are often the opposite of survival, that people who engage in these kinds of things, whether it's anti-Blackness or Blacks committing acts of violence against Asians, are essentially kind of, if they're more common, if they were, it's because it's the path of least resistance. It's something that you can do supposedly on an individual level to ensure that maybe you are better off today, at least for one day, than you were yesterday. But ensuring that these things don't happen again requires that people look beyond their own self-interest and think about what's better for society, not just better for them, but better for their neighbors, better for their children, better for their community. And that really, really takes a lot of effort, which is why we study these things, right? I mean, in school and in life, we're often told on a kind of vernacular level, you just need to work hard and stay out of trouble. And that's fine and dandy, but unfortunately, we wouldn't have progress in this country if people just worked hard and stayed out of trouble. To be honest, we wouldn't even have a United States of America if people just worked hard and stayed out of trouble. It took people to come up with the will to protest, to dissent, and to eventually fight for what they truly believed in. And because of that, we have this American tradition of having to fight in order to gain progress in this country, whether it's to even have a country, whether to end slavery, whether to make sure women and other people in this country had the right to vote, immigrant rights, LGBT rights, et cetera, et cetera. And that requires a lot of work. And I think it requires us to recognize that, it doesn't happen naturally. And so, these incidents, as unfortunate as they are, have to be a reminder to us that we need to put into this work in order for social justice and progress to happen. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for that. A very rich conversation around it. And so Jenny and Angie, I know that you guys didn't get a chance to chime in on that, but I do want to move us forward, just being cognizant of time here. Jenny, I do have a question that came from a College of Business student that I'd like to ask you. That is, what can businesses do to demonstrate that they are actively diverse in their business practices? And so one of the things that question strikes at for me is over the last couple of years, there's been this uptick in the amount of funding allocated to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? We do I don't want to say we do a good job of it. We do a lot of it in higher education. And I know that there are a lot of private companies who are also doing this type of work. Is it working? Are they doing enough? Are they making an impact? And so I want to kind of pose that set of questions to you.
Yeah, Vanessa, it's a great question. And it's one of the things I'm really interested in understanding myself in my work. There is so much work to be done. So some of the research that I've done is showing that really the buck stops at firms, universities, people are able to get educations, so we have diverse students getting PhDs. And so some of that is, kind of working well. There's a very, very leaky pipeline for diverse STEM students into technology employment. And so it's gotten worse. And so over the past 20, 30 years. And so there's a really big question here from the student. What are some things that they can do? So we have processes in firms to recruit, to hire, to promote. All of those processes are designed and they generate certain outcomes. The design of those processes will have to be changed to generate different outcomes. And again, in the research that I was talking about earlier, there's a lot at stake in getting that right. So I don't think that we have a lot of answers on how to change those processes, but we know we need to. There's, obviously work being done on that. But I absolutely agree with the person who asked the question, that is really the right question to be asking, and where we could actually have an impact.
Yeah. So the answer is there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
I think we've made some inroads, but there are some people focus at the top that the change needs to come from the top. The other ones think that these types of systemic change are better when they come from everyone, people getting involved and doing the hard work. So it honestly needs to be a confluence of the two. You need the leaders at the top, but you also need the people to be invested in the work of the community. So that's what I hear you're saying, right? And so now I want to move to Angie. I see her hands up. I have a lot of questions for you, but I'm going to let you talk and say what you got to say first.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So I'm just kind of reflecting on the sentiments at the beginning and the kind of comments throughout the presentation. And I kind of find one thread that goes through, and that kind of get my question that you're about to ask me. What would be the the types of actions that will move us forward in the direction for the future, that kind of thing. So at the beginning, when Russell had Jenny and Phuong narrated the really horrific laments, one student of mine, I can tell, well, thank you for being here, Paige, said that the silence of bystander is loud. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's so loud. And my suggestion is, please do not be silent. Please get bystander intervention training. I can put in the chat for you. It's called Hollaback bystander and harassment in all its forms. It is awesome. It is great. So, and I learned from that, and I need to practice it, you know, need to practice, but there are many ways for you to intervene. So that's one point. The second point is coming from Quasar. Hi, Quasar. Nice to see you here virtually. He had a couple of questions, but I'm going to pick one of his three questions. You know, he has three standard NCBI questions. I want to pick the third one. He asked, actually the second one. What are substantial actions people can take to ally and support Asian communities when they are experiencing elevated hate and attacks? So yes, taking Hollaback bystander class is one, and second is trying to do some teach-in workshops. I mean, I'm after all a teacher, so I love workshop. I love teaching workshops. I think that it is so important to raise consciousness, to raise understanding, like the one that Phuong was saying earlier, to raise understanding about all of those things, the history of it, and also to me as a global studies person, to understand the transnational processes, because I see parallels. I'm a labor person, I'm a transnational person. I can see the parallels of exploitation happening in Asian Pacific region and happening right here in Central American, in the Americas. So we need to educate ourselves about global transnational processes of migration, because capitalist system will always need cheap labor or replacement workers. And that's what we are seeing right now, right here, of the H-2A visa guest workers from Mexico, from Central America, to come here and do the 3D jobs, dirty, dehumanizing, and demeaning. The final point is that I think it's important to understand legislation, the laws. And I just want to mention one law that affects these migration patterns. And I think we need to pay attention to the ongoing Farm Workers Modernization Act of 2021. It already passed the House. If it were to be passed by the Senate, which is a big question mark, but who knows, this bill will be potentially positive. I hedge myself, potentially positive impacts on local farm workers and potentially our students' families, because we have a lot of, first-gen students here, and the H-2A guest workers. So, and of course, I have critical thinking about, what does it mean to unionization. But the point I want to make here is that try to understand legislation and the laws, and to be able to advocate for justice.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Angie. So in the limited amount of time we have left, I do want to ask another question that was submitted by a College of Business student. They're on fire, right? But what can be done to address online harassment, particularly through social media, of people based on their ethnicity? Anyone can go.
Well, I could start. There's two things we could do. Again, like Angie just talked about, from the top and from the bottom. From anybody who sees online racism, they can report it, right? Just like they could report to Stop API Hate, they could report to whatever platform and saying, this person violates the codes of conduct, usually, because most broader platforms have codes of conduct of how to, that guide communications and discussions. But from the top, we have to really hold corporations, social media companies accountable. You say you publish these guidelines. Do you adhere to them? How much do you practice and hold people accountable themselves? So we need a system that tracks how well these corporations adhere to their own principles. And finally, there is legislation now. The more insidious thing is that we know that online companies use algorithms to attract audiences, to provide and filter information to people. And those algorithms then discriminate so that they get certain, messages from certain groups, certain types of information from certain groups that can perpetuate racism, that don't give people different perspectives, that lead to conspiracy theories. So there's legislation to hold corporations accountable, to be more transparent about those algorithms that lead to that type of discriminatory misinformation. It's just a scary, maybe one of the other faculty could speak to that, but it's a scary process that is often hidden. That we just assume, we get all the correct news, we just get information the way that's unbiased, but it's clear even the faculty here would get certain types of information only.
Yeah, Phuong, go ahead, please.
I'm just thinking, and I don't know to what extent it actually has happened, to what extent journalism could play a role in really exposing and highlighting the harassment that goes on social media. First, at maybe at the local level with local publications starting to do this. I mean, newspapers are really starving for affordable content right now, and everybody's got a phone nowadays. They could hire somebody who is dedicated to searching for online harassment and publishing or airing it on a regular basis. And I don't know if they ever would do it, but if they did it, it would really deter harassment, I think, by a significant margin, especially at the local level. If people who we thought were nicer people were exposed for the people that they really are, at least on their social media selves.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective, Phuong. I tend to agree with you. One of the things that we know is that money talks, right? And so if consumers would start to think of themselves as being empowered to push back against these algorithms and through these various forms of oppression, because that's actually what happens to us when you search for Black woman and all you see are negative images of ourselves, right? And so when we think about searching for other groups, what are we seeing? And then when we see these things, what do we do about it? And so it's how we organize ourselves and empower ourselves to be that change we want to see in the world. Jenny, you're up.
Yeah, I in some ways, I'm the worst person to ask this question because I've never been on Facebook and I never will. And I'm still here. Like, I think a lot of people now have this idea that if it's on Facebook, or only if it's on Facebook, does it exist? But there are people here living in the real world, and we're doing just fine. And I think it might be extreme to say everybody get off Facebook, like get off social media. But if we just scale that back a little bit, we could demand that our institutions not keep pushing Facebook on us, right? So like our universities can stop forcing us to use Facebook. Our local, NPR stations or whatever, stop pushing Facebook and things like that. I mean, there are ways that, our institutions don't have to be pushing us to use some of these social media tools. And I think that we can, as consumers, as citizens, we can demand that at least.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And thank you all for sharing your perspectives with us today. And so we're just about out of time. I know, where did the time go? I feel like I need to stay in this conversation for at least another hour, but I won't do that. I'll honor my colleagues. I'll honor the people in the audience. And so I do want to invite the people in the audience back into the conversation. I do have a couple of calls to action I'm going to put out there in front of you guys, but I will say this to my dear panelists. I'll be asking each of you to write up a brief reflection in a one paragraph, just a reflection on today's event. And then that way I can pull it together into an op-ed so that we can share it, not just in this forum, but with a broader audience as well. So happy to be able to do that. And so what I'm going to do now is to just do a brief call to action. I'm going to ask you guys 3 questions. Everybody in the audience, everybody on the panel, you're free to put your responses into the chat. The first is, what is one thing that you learned today that you could share with one other person? What would that be? Just one key takeaway that you learned from listening and reflecting and being here in this space with us today. So if you could put that into the chat, that would be appreciated. And I know I have some long-winded colleagues out there, so I'll allow you just a little space to get your thoughts together and type something in. Doesn't have to be very detailed. All right, so thank you guys for that. So now my second question is, the question is, who do you know in any of the many different Asian communities that you could reach out to support or to become an ally for? And so the question is, who do you know in the many different Asian communities that exist that you could reach out to and support to become an ally? This could be an individual or a group. And the reason we ask you to do this is because, to me, it's what matters the most. It's not just you spending this hour and a half with us today. It's how do you mobilize and strategize to act to make our society better? And so it's this type of critical reflection that's needed in order to move society forward. And so my last question is this: what is one thing that you can commit to doing in the next 30 days to support any of the Asian communities that you've heard about today? Just one thing. Doesn't have to be long or lengthy or complicated. Just one thing you could commit to doing. And I'll go back and read those questions. The first was, what's one thing, an idea or concept that you learned today that you'd like to share, that you could share with another person? The second question was, who do you know in any of the many different Asian communities that you could reach out to and support or to become an ally for? And that could be an individual or a group. And the last question was, what is one thing you could commit to doing in the next 30 days to support any of the Asian communities? And so before I wrap up today, I'd like to invite my colleagues, Dr. Vivian Waldrop-Patterson and Dr. Brian Corpening, who co-moderate this co-op with me, to leave you guys with some lasting words from our event today. Thank you.
I guess what I would say is this has been, just a powerful, it has been a powerful experience. And I would call on everybody, to take the call to actions that were provided seriously. Let's just each pick one thing that we can do and see if we can make a ripple effect that reaches every Asian community, from here to everywhere. Because I think that really is what it's going to take. It's our individual commitments, but also the collective impact of those commitments that is going to make a difference now and going forward. And I'll just leave it there and turn it over to Brian Corpening.
I agree with that, Vivian, and I have been involved in countless events and panels and forums over my career, and I'm not engaging in hyperbole when I say that this was excellent, and this was extremely powerful, and I was struck by all the things that took place. Russell, your courage and your commitment is inspirational. I know the work you're not doing is easy, but it's necessary, so thank you for that. Angie, what you said in terms of the proverb, and that struck me, unity brings life. And your commitment and your statement about cross-racial solidarity, that's community. And when Vivian and Vanessa and I first started this 3 years ago, it was about how do you build community? And we know community is about collaboration. And we know that it's also about understanding and discovery. And tonight was about discovery, but also about understanding. And that's how we build community. So I say to all of my colleagues who were on this call and those who weren't on this call, and we need to tell them that they missed something powerful and profound, that we need to flock to build community. So I'm still in your word, Russell. We need to flock to build community, because there's nothing more important about sustaining what we're trying to do, committing ourselves to each other, and making this world better for us all than community. So thank you.
All right, Marlena, that's it. We're done.
I hope we have a sequel.
I hope we do too. I know this has been powerful, and I always just feel like there's just not enough time to get to all the good stuff